Good day, everyone. Welcome to the American Society of International Economic Law Global Engagement Series, now American Society of International Law. The title for this webinar is The Prospects of Electoral Democracy in 2023, Africa's Elections, Courts, and the Rise of Authoritarianism. My name is Titilayo Adebola. I'm the president of the African International Economic Law Network. I'm an editor on Afronomics Law and Associate Director, Center for Commercial Law at the University of Aberdeen. Several African countries, including Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Madagascar, and Zimbabwe, will hold or have held elections this year. Whether these elections will be free and fair will be crucial to safeguarding their nascent democracies. Since incumbents in all of these countries except Nigeria are running for the second terms, another crucial question to watch is whether there will be political party turnovers as a result of presidential transitions. The wave of 2023 elections happened amidst a global rise in authoritarianism. That is why free and fair presidential elections in Africa will be vital to defending democratic transitions and popular governance. Compromised and mismanaged elections could put these African countries on the path towards autocratic rule, especially when there is so much social and economic dislocation arising from a convergence of crises, including debt defaults, hyperinflation, climate change, COVID-19 and pandemic aftermaths, violence, insurgencies, ethnic conflicts, and wars. For instance, in Zimbabwe, where the ruling Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front has retained power for 43 years, and opposition activist Ali was abducted in June 2022 on the outskirts of Harare. Her mutilated body was subsequently found in a well nearby. Other opposition activists who attended her funeral were arrested and incarcerated for inciting violence. Conflicts, human rights violations, and impunity escalate under authoritarian and unaccountable governments. Conversely, peaceful and successful electoral democracies can contribute to building a prosperous Africa, as envisioned in the African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Good Governance, and the African Union's Agenda 2063. The African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, is its strategic plan to transform Africa into the global economic capital of the future. Through Agenda 2063, the African Union seeks to shift from addressing Africa's colonial and post-colonial political struggles to prioritizing inclusive social and economic development. The African Union's ambitious Agenda 2063 and its flagship programs, including the African Continental Free Trade Area, can only thrive in a peaceful Africa that respects the rule of law. As we have seen in Kenya and Malawi, courts play vital normative roles in upholding the rule of law by resolving electoral disputes, invalidating electoral irregularities, and upholding constitutional provisions. I'm delighted to be joined by expert panelists to have this conversation today. We have Ms. Adaobi Egboka, the African Program Director, Cyrus Vance Center for International Justice, New York. Adaobi is a human rights advocate with more than 11 years experience working on access to justice, the rule of law, and good governance. We're also delighted to have Professor Gitu Muigai, Senior Counsel and Senior Partner, Mohammed Muigai LLP in Kenya. He is the former Attorney General of Kenya. He has vast experience litigating election cases. I'll start with a question for you, Ms. Adaobi Egboka. Africa has a busy presidential election calendar in 2023. While some elections are being held as scheduled, Some, such as in Chad, Guinea-Bissau, and Mali, have been delayed or disrupted due to conflicts or coups. While the recent Nigerian election has been successfully concluded, it, like many African elections in the recent past, was accompanied by logistical and organizational missteps. How should African governments and electoral commissions learn from their past and in so doing prepare better to avoid logistical and organizational missteps that undermine the legitimacy of elections and their outcomes?
Thank you so much. So first I will say thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation and for the great timely topic at this time. Oh, I hear you. Africa has a busy election this year. We've seen delays, we've seen disruptions in for different reasons. And there are lots of muddled up controversies everywhere. So spanning from both West, Central, Southern Africa, many countries in Africa has elections this year. I've just heard you talk about that. We see that Nigeria, which is supposedly the giant of Africa, just concluded its presidential and National Assembly elections and the governorship elections. And when I hear you talk about successful, I smile because there are so many debates on that, but I'm not going to dwell on that. We've also seen that DRC Congo will come up in December, late December. We're all looking forward to see what that will be. And another very key important thing to note is also the idea of re-election and how that plays a key role in Africa. We see the DRC Congo, Liberia, Madagascar, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, all of them are going to come in for re-election, and we know what that entails. But I'm not going to dwell on all those issues. I'll just answer your question straight in terms of what can we learn from our past, or what can government learn from their past, and what can they do differently to ensure a different outcome. I'll say the rules are very clear. I'm glad you talked about the African Charter on Democracy, Election and Governance, and how it has created a lot of accountability framework for governance. It has it rules out issues to ensure free, fair, and credible elections as basis of legitimate government, right? Build democratic institution and ensure the rule of law. Those are very clear. So the rules are there. We're not going to go into the rules. I'll just look at practical issues in terms of what are the issues that we can look at directly. So one for me will be the role of security services in election. While we agree that there is a need for the presence of police and other security personnel at polling units during elections to contain both violent group and protect election materials, there's also need to ensure that politicians do not use these security personnel as a tool for voter intimidation. We have seen security agents used to harass both voters, political opponents, and even for ballot snatching. I hear you talk about Zimbabwe, and we see how the ruling party, the ruling African National Union Patriotic Front has been accused, I'm not going to say used, has been accused of using violence and intimidation by security forces to retain its 43-year grip in power, right? We've also seen in Nigeria where we've seen videos where security personnel were caught on videos looting away ballot boxes. These are security services deployed to protect elections. They must at all times be equipped with clear rules of engagement. There should be functional and effective mechanism for citizens to find adequate redress in case of abuse. So one is that the security agencies must have clear rules of engagement. Two, there must be ways for the citizens to really get effective remedy. And then government must ensure that human right-based approaches in dealing with electoral security and its violence. So that's one, right? Two, I think about how else, and I think about the election management bodies should be independent. And when I mean independent in all areas and at all times. In doing this, I think the election management bodies that we have in a lot of our countries in Africa must first accept where they have challenges and shortcomings, and they must accept that on time. This will help manage public expectations, but also help to develop partnerships to support them where necessary. We've seen many allegations of bias, rigging, and use of incumbents to perpetrate electoral fraud. We've seen in Nigeria how the Independent National Electoral Commission has been accused of not following its own processes and earmarked rules set out for the elections by the Electoral Act in the just concluded elections. The question is then, what are the when we think about transparency and reduce opportunities for voter rigging and to ensure that elections are not manipulated? These are things that government has to do to ensure real independence of these electoral bodies. We see that in Kenya elections, which everybody would say, yes, really show the great best practices in allowing real-time monitoring of electoral results by citizens and watchdog groups, which also increased the integrity of the elections. Even though I know Prof and others in Kenya may also argue that the delay in uploading some of the results helps to manipulate the election outcome. But really, when I talk about independence, I mean that for us to really create legitimacy, the independent electoral bodies must be at all times independent. In Zimbabwe, we see the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission being perceived as biased. Is that for me? Okay. Being perceived as biased, right? We've seen that about 15% of the electoral body staffs are formal service personnel. We've also seen where the chief election officer is a retired major general. In Madagascar, we see where the Independent National Electoral Commission is elected by the president and the executive controls his budget. So these are like issues, if we want to deal with legitimacy, we must ensure that these bodies are really independent. Lastly, I see that my time is up, but I'm just going to quickly rule out the last one. The last one for me is information management. To ensure legitimacy, there's a huge need for government, political parties, and all partners, both local and international, to keep finding ways to address hate speech and management of fake news. There's a lot happening on social media. It's a great platform for freedom of expression and assembly, but there's also a weapon for fake news. So we see a lot of that. And so there must be ways to effectively manage the news that comes out of it. Government must ensure that the information environment remains open while supporting legitimate efforts to combat disinformation, misinformation. It must avoid total information blockout, like we see in shutting down of the internet, like we see in countries like Uganda and the rest of them. I'll just stop on that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for raising those pertinent points. I'll go to Prof next. Kenya held a closely contested presidential election in 2022, with William Ruto securing 50.5% of votes and Raila Odinga securing 48.9% of votes, a difference of about 233,000 votes out of over 14 million votes cast. Kenya employed real-time monitoring of electoral results by providing open recording of votes, which allowed the Kenyan citizens, civil society organizations, and media to collate results simultaneously. An election petition was filed to challenge the results. What core lessons can other African countries learn from Kenya's experience with handling presidential petitions in the last 3 electoral cycles? Would you please like to unmute?
Yeah, I just wanted to give you a visual, and it's a bit difficult. Is it okay if I stay offline or
Yes,
off
please.
video?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think that Kenya's path has been a long and tedious one. We started the process of electoral reform just after the reintroduction of multi-party politics in 1992. And we've had successes, and we've also had failures. I think the success we've achieved at the moment is in the use of technology. And that technology has made it possible for the election to be monitored by observers, by ordinary citizens, by media, and so on. But as we all know, technology has its own limitations. And that has been the source of great many arguments in the Supreme Court about its use, about the veracity of its outcomes, and so on and so forth. I've had the great fortune to be involved in all 4 presidential petitions since 2013 in one form or other. And I'm able to say, without fear of contradiction, that technology has been a big, big, big step forward. It has made the process not perfect, but substantially transparent. And so much so that it is possible for the ordinary citizen to take a fairly good view of what the outcome will be as the voting is proceeding. I must warn, however, as we all know now, from various reports globally, that the very providers of these technologies have themselves stated that they are able to manipulate these processes. And we know of many countries in which these analytical firms, or whatever the acronyms they use, have boasted of having been able to infiltrate the system and make contributions, negative or positive, mostly negative. Now, let me say something about the court. The court, in my view, ought to be an institution of last resort. We shouldn't be proud that the courts are resolving electoral disputes. There ought not to be electoral disputes because the processes should be so transparent, so clear, so verifiable. And I think, in my experience, sometimes we interfere with, we take away from the integrity of the judicature if every time there is a political conflict, we pull down the courts into that conflict to pronounce in what is purely a political outcome. Of course, lawyers dress political conflict in the garb of legal disputes. But at the end of the day, the truth is an electoral dispute is a political dispute. And we should be wary of turning the judiciary into a political actor, because the election comes around every 5 years, but the judiciary must remain to settle all other non-political day-to-day problems, problems of commerce, problems of law enforcement, problems of family, and so on and so forth. Now, I am proud that Kenya has, in its own way, through a very difficult struggle, some of it taking us to the precipice of a civil war, of a terrible, terrible conflict in 2008, that resulted in Kenya becoming a subject country before the ICC. And I was involved in that process when I was Attorney General for 4 years. while we have made very, very serious progress, and maybe we are a beacon of hope to places where people have the ballot stuffed and they have no way of verifying whether what they voted is what is at the tallying center. I think that we must be sensitive to the cultural and historical nuances of each region. And each region has its own historical antecedents. For example, in Kenya, the military and the security forces have never occupied a dominant position in national life. That's just a historical. The military and the security forces have always been there in the background of civilian rule. Now, I cannot expect that to be replicated in Mali or Chad or you know, that has to be dealt with with the special circumstances of that region and it's whatever. So I personally feel we are moving in the right direction. We wish we were to move much faster as a continent. I personally, now in the evening of my life, has become a little disillusioned in elections as the barometer of democracy and political change. And I think we must begin to look at our societies in a way that allows us to see elections as part of a bigger political transformation that must take place. Let me give you an example. One of the weakest links in the Kenyan democratic chain is political parties. Political parties are very, very weak. They are very opportunistic. Mostly, every 5 years, they are cobbled together as a winning coalition. They have no consistent ideology or following, and therefore they are not purveyors of ideology around which political community can organize for big social transformation. I hope that's of some use. Should I say anything more?
No, not this round. Thank you very much, Prof, for the robust and insightful comments from Kenya and lessons for other African countries. I'll come back to you, Ms. Egboka, please. Many commentators note that although regular elections are now commonplace, creating a democratic culture and entrenching good governance in Africa remains a work in progress. On this view, many regimes continue to be at best hybrid, delegative, and illiberal in the sense that they feature both democratic and authoritarian traits and remain inefficient and irresponsive to popular demands. Is this true or not? And how would you like to explain this? Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I hear Prof, and I hear you ask this question. I'm just laughing because obviously it's true. I completely agree. In Africa, many countries, many of our countries are dangling between democracy and authoritarian regimes. That's the sincere truth. Democracy in the sense that many are supposedly elected into power. What we are currently seeing in many places, not just in Africa, I would say across the globe, is that human rights and equal treatments are under the law are under serious attack. Really by weak regimes that are really choosing or thwarting the basic norms and institutions made to support liberal democracies. We're seeing situations where people are exploiting the weaknesses of the systems to promote violence, hatred, impunity at its highest level. Democracies have really been harmed from within by illiberal forces, including politicians willing to corrupt and charter the very institutions that brought them to power. We saw in Uganda election, the last Uganda election, we saw what Museveni did to his supporters, to his opponents, and to his opponents. An incumbent president using security forces to arrest opposition candidates, suppress voter participation, both shutdown of the internet and other manipulation, deregister civil society organizations, and many things. And so that makes me think, when I think about this, I remember growing up in Africa, one common thing that we all learned about democracy, and in its very simplest form, was that democracy is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. That's like the general thing we all sang like song growing up. And that is a governing system that is based on the will and consent of the governed. Institutions that function and are accountable to all citizens, where the rule is observed, there's respect for human rights, where there is accountability and checks and balances, independent courts, press, civil society organizations, and the likes. I hear Prof talk about the courts, and that's a worry for many, in the sense that many of our elections now are being decided by the court and no longer the polling units. And these are things that could be avoided from the onset. So that's something that is resonating to all. We find that government now see free assembly, speech, and association as nuisance, which shouldn't be in a democratic situation. This democratic ideals has become a mirage in many ways in Africa. We see elected presidents who pretend to run a reconciliatory government after tough-won elections, talking about government of those who voted for them and those who didn't vote for them. We saw that in Nigeria when President Barry came into power. We also see that with President Ruto of Kenya now, with the same rhetorics about those who voted and who didn't vote for them, which shouldn't be, right? We have really seen governments in Africa find a lot of ways to elude any checks and balances. For example, we have the institutionalization of term units was really the idea to reduce the overconcentration of power in the executive. And we've had governments who have now manipulated constitutions, eliminated and modified term units to stay in power. In Africa now, it's almost an average of 12 years in power that we find. And there are lots of indices to reinforce this. The Economic Intelligence Annual Index has showed overall decline of democracy in Africa in the past years. Freedom in the World report last year, I know they launched this year's report yesterday, but I haven't had the time to look at it, noted that this is 16 consecutive years of decline of global freedom. Last year's setbacks that we saw in Africa include news media in North Africa and freedom of assembly in Senegal, and social media shutdown in many countries, over 10 countries in Africa. We're currently seeing what's happening in Tunisia. So there's a whole lot going on. We see countries like Burundi, Uganda, where incumbents used the pandemic to strengthen their grip on power as they conducted elections using public health to restrict competition, cut out opposition, and restrict election observation. For me to conclude, I would say that there are no preconditions, economic, cultural, or historical, to democracy in Africa. We must all continue to find ways to continue to assist and pressure democracy. Secondly, democracy is not automatic. I heard Prof when he was talking about democracy and the thoughts, and many of us are thinking about it. We must continue as civil society organizations, individuals, and all citizens to demand and support democracy and ensure that our institutions are functional to constrain behaviors. Because if our institutions are working, a lot of this will change. And answering my first question that you asked me about, how can government learn from the past to change the future? It's funny because our institutions are the same that weaken the democracy that we have. Look at Nigeria, for example. A government sat down, looked at itself, and realized that manual voting was a problem. I hear Prof talk about technology and its gains. That manual voting was a big problem for us in Nigeria. The government worked hard, borrowed money, worked so hard to institute a new technology that will help for both transmission of results to a central unit. And then same government wouldn't even obey that rule. Under same government, we're having a lot of a lot of opposition coming up, a lot of people questioning the same thing that the government sought by itself. So tell me about it. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ebuka. That is just brilliant. You're spot on time. And you have just raised very excellent points in relation to the role of states, non-state actors, institutions, and the conceptualization of democracy and democracies in African context. I think both you and Prof have touched on. I'll move next to Professor Mugai. In addition to the crumbling socioeconomic conditions in many African countries, as exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, threats to free and fair elections in Africa include the lack of transparency in electoral campaign financing, externally sponsored disinformation campaigns, deficient technologies for voting, collating, and transmission of electoral results, and widespread corruption, including vote buying. How can African countries address these threats in future elections?
Well, you have hit the nail on the head. One of the most enduring problems of electoral reform in our continent, like in others, I am very sure it's a major issue in American politics. It's electoral financing. And we all pay lip service. The politicians, let's talk about them first. They pay lip service to the need to keep money, or at least especially dirty money, out of politics. Everybody pays lip service to that. And then when we get to drafting the instruments, they want the instruments in such general and vague language. And even when that has gone through and we have an election financing law, the ability to inform it, the institutional capacity to enforce it is almost non-existent. Because if you look at the Electoral Commission, for example, in virtually everywhere on our continent, it is so constrained financially at times, in terms of human resources at other times, but it is not able to carry out voter registration and then carry out the election, the counting, the tallying, the announcement, then to defend election petitions in numerous courts, and at the same time, be able to go back and say, how did the politicians spend their money? It's a self-reporting system. It's like an ethics, an anti-bribery regime. You have to report yourself. What was your income in the year? You're filling a form. The ability of the institution receiving the form to interrogate it and to carry out a verification is almost non-existent. So this is going to be a problem with us for the foreseeable future. But it is made worse. It is made worse by the fact that the elements that seek to buy elections will usually be the elements that have access to unbanked money and money that cannot be verified. And therefore, you have a dual problem of inability to limit the influence of money in the democracy. But even worse, the inability to contain illegal flows of cash into the political system and the political process. I see this as a medium-term challenge, because not only do we have it in the context of politics, we have it in the context of the management of the economy in general. And that is to say, we have weak systems to police illegal inflows, and that is harmful to the economy itself. And it's part of what I think that a good democratic culture ought to be able to address. Let me talk about something in the 2 minutes left that you had asked earlier. There is a very worrisome lurch to the right in Africa because after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the decade that followed, in which we restored multi-party democracies, wrote fresh constitutions, and began to build independent constitutional institutions. And I think we became a little complacent. Somewhere down the way, inspired by the right-wing, the success of right-wing regimes everywhere, from Mexico to the United States itself, to India, to God knows, all these places. The African political leadership swung to the right. And they swung to the right, repealed term limits, notwithstanding judicial challenges, abrogated what were believed to have been agreed as the fundamental pillars of the democracy: a free judiciary, a free electoral commission, a free civil society, a free press. And we saw that the move to the right came with an erosion of all these areas. So that for all of us, the idea now is not even to begin a fresh revolution, is to mend the one, to protect the one we already have that is under threat of erosion, to restore media freedom, to restore the vibrancy of civil society, to restore the integrity of the electoral process, to restore the independence of constitutional institutions. So you must forgive me if I sound a little bit like a man who doesn't want to rush to tomorrow's revolution, because I believe today's is a bit in threat, and we must rehabilitate it before we move forward. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Prof. And you have just invited us to begin to think about our current realities before moving on to how we will address the future repercussions. Next, I'll go to Ms. Eboka and ask, taking into account how incumbent political parties marginalize opposition political parties and leaders, and the often short-lived nature of political parties in many African countries, what role can political parties in Africa play to ensure free and fair elections?
Thank you so much. I must agree that, yes, political parties have the power to shape our electoral processes, and that's why it's very important the activities are continuously scrutinized by all. But for me, first, governments and election bodies must ensure a level playing field for incumbent and opposition parties and candidates. That's what we see as a problem. They must apply the electoral regulations and rule equally to all. In Uganda, we saw President, I don't know why I keep going back, but I'm just going to drop on Uganda this time. I think I've talked about them a lot. But these are just ensuring that the government must ensure first there's a level playing field. What then can political parties do? When I think about what then can political parties do, first for me will be party structures and rules. We've seen that these are both informal and formal structures of political parties. Issues around gender equality, youth participation, ethnicity, religion, cultural, other key diversity issues that are important to us in Africa must be taken into account. And these are very critical for us to ensure that we have, because this, how am I gonna say it? When we talk about religion, ethnicity, it sounds strange, but these are our real realities in Africa. And this has crucial implications for democracy, legitimacy, and the resilience. So really, first, our political parties must first look at its internal structures. Where are women? Where are the gender voices? Where are the youths? Who is wearing what hat? Who is doing what within the party structures? Because that's where the problem really starts from. That for me is like one major thing political parties must do. Secondly, we talk about, no, I won't say secondly, within the first structure is also the idea of ideology. What really is there, we all come in and we talk about manifestos and the rest of them. What really is the political party's ideology? Secondly, for me, will be campaign funds and political endorsements. Most times the ruling parties are the ones who has the stronger political network and incentives of potential contributors to align themselves with them because of continuity, because you know that when you support the government in power, then if they remain in power, which usually is the case, they're going to your businesses and all that. So you see a lot of people supporting them and endorsing them. Political parties must, another bigger issue is also party nomination tickets are very expensive and unaffordable for the regular individuals. Thereby, you see that what is happening is it leaves the party ticket to the highest bidder, who buys up delegates, buys up voter, goes into election with all means, and his goal is to recoup all the money he has spent, because it becomes a do or die affair. He's bribing everybody. He has spent so much to acquire the ticket. And bearing in mind that we also have young people, average citizens who want to also run for these elections, who do not have all these huge amounts that are being called for party tickets. So I think those are something that the political parties have to start in within themselves to really look at, which is a key issue as it relates to that. Another thing I think about is the quality of information, the accurate information that emanates from these political parties regarding their candidates and political parties. We see political parties' role really is to recruit candidates for election, both legislative and executive office under its label, provide them with a manifesto. How many manifestos do we remember in many of the elections that we hear? There's so many things that we think about instead of looking at the manifestos, which never really happens. So it has been argued that we've seen incumbents manipulate these informations by creating unequal access to public media, because the incumbents most times own the public media. They own the spaces for campaigns. They own the stadiums. They own the billboards, right? So you see them, they own the national TVs, the national radios. So there's lots of limitations for other candidates who also wants to campaign equally on this platform. But this is changing. I'll say that social media has really changed the dynamics. We saw that in Nigeria. We saw how information of an opposition party strengthened over time, starting from social media to the traditional media. The beauty is now that in Africa, there is becoming growing sophistication of voters, increasing strength of civil society and independent media, which will help to really hinder these incumbents political party manipulating voter information. So we saw, and I think that was same in Kenya, where the social media played a lot of role in these elections. I see you vomited your mic, but I'm coming. Thank you. The political parties should also, peace accords play a good role. So I think that's something that they must also really enter and respect, to run peaceful, issue-based, national unity-oriented campaigns, as well as in its election outcomes. So election where candidates are knowing that win or lose, they must manage the expectation of their supporters. We saw that in Nigeria, where a candidate lost, and then he's encouraging his voters not to go into violent protests, encourage them to stay away even from the court premises during the hearing to avoid any violent outcome. So this is something that political parties can encourage. Well, above all for me, and I'm going to end with that, is that political parties must publicly advocate protection and respect for human rights and promise to hold accountable their supporters who commit human rights abuses. All candidates at all times must convey clear messages in their campaigns, both to their agents and supporters, that intimidation and violence against persons and property will not be tolerated by the leadership. That for me is a way that political parties can do a lot. I'll just stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ebuka, for those comments. I think that you have touched on some practical aspects of the conversations about elections. So I liked how you mentioned just gender inclusivity. You talked about youth. You talked about the role of contemporary social media platforms in generating interest in these conversations we're having and in pushing the way votes are developing. Next, I'll go to Prof. Mugai. And I'd like to also invite participants to please begin to share their questions. So you could please type your questions and place them in the Q&A function. And immediately after Professor Mugai's final comment, we'll open up the floor to the Q&A session. In several instances, electoral disputes have been taken to Africa's fledgling international courts, such as the East African Court of Justice, the African Court on Human Rights and People's Rights, as well as the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice. What role do you see these international courts playing in ensuring free and fair elections now and in the future?
Well, let me start by saying that I am a very great supporter of regional courts. And at some point in history, I served on the African Court of Human Rights in Arusha for a brief time. Now, my concern is that when you internationalize domestic political disputes, you do two things at the same time. One, you undermine the international court because you invite it to make decisions relating to some other to a member country whose impact is a purely domestic matter. And if that other country fails to enforce the order of a regional court, the standing of that regional court is diminished. Secondly, I personally believe that, and I'll tell you, I had an experience when I worked in government, or an amazing experience, where in our region, a head of state had approached Parliament with a view to remove term limits. That head of state lost the vote in Parliament. That dispute was then presented to the Supreme Court of that country. And that court ruled in favor of the removal of term limits. That issue became a regional diplomatic geopolitical crisis. And there were many who felt that the right thing to do is to refer that issue to a regional court, and so on and so forth. Now, my own view then, and my own view now, is that that does not create stability for the regional court, and it antagonizes a member state, which then withdraws support for a court that requires the support of everybody. Our regional courts were not created to decide political questions. They were intended to determine socio-economic, especially commercial matters. I do not think that the time is ripe to draw them into real commercial political conflicts. You will recall when the United States withdrew from the World Court over the huge dispute with Nicaragua about the mining of Nicaraguan harbors. So I'm trying to say that international law has a long history of grappling with how far an international tribunal should go in trying to address matters of a purely political character. So I am not a great fan of internationalizing domestic political conflict. Having said that, I think that it is possible for regional courts to provide, in appropriate cases, a broad jurisprudence reaffirming the fundamentals around which the member states ought to manage their affairs. And this can go to broad issues, rule of law issues, political participation issues, inclusion issues, and so on and so forth. Then a day is coming, I hope that day is in our lifetimes, when it will be possible to litigate purely political questions without undermining the integrity of the court itself. And when I was a student of these matters, I remember even the Inter-American Court had serious challenges around this jurisdictional issue. And I know that many countries, many politicians, many advisors to governments will not advise governments to enter into treaties that have the potential to decide purely domestic disputes of a political character in a forum outside the nation state itself. I hope that's of some use.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugai. That is of very much use. And I hear you talking about just the compartmentalization of issues. So domestic issues should stay within the national boundaries. International courts can set out protocols, they can set out guidelines, they can set out practices for member states to draw from. And I also hear you saying how we should separate political from social economic, because we can have some influences in the ways decisions will be made. So now I'll open up the floor to questions from participants. But before I do that, I would like to thank both our panelists for the excellent opening comments in our first session. The first question is from Professor Gathi, and it is for Professor Mugai, but since he just spoke, I think I'll start with Professor Olabisi Akinkunbe's question. It's both for Professor and Ms. Eboka, and just Prof, so that you get some time to breathe. I'll start with Ms. Eboka. How do you think we might improve gender participation in elections? Might legislative interventions, for example, through constitutional amendments and responses that require a quota representation, be too radical? I ask because the current results from Nigeria's parliamentary elections have only 4 women so far.
Thank you. That's a question that many of us has dealt with for many years, and we're still not there. And so, yes, I agree. And the truth is that in Africa, there are many opportunities. The Maputo Protocol has really provided that platform for such engagements of women in politics and women in engagement in governance. We also look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we all agree that women equal participation in government is central to democracy and achieving any sustainable development. So that is not an argument. When we think about is constitution a choice? Yes, I agree. Remember that the CEDAW Convention had for many, God knows how many years, provided for gender equality, and many women in Africa had taken it in different ways. So in some countries, we looked at it through an affirmative action, so asking for 35% of seats in and for a time limit, not permanently, right? For a time limit for women to catch up. And that's something that a lot of women have advocated in many places, but we struggle because of the whole African perception to culture, to religion, patriarchal nature of the society, and arguments around where women belong and where they do not belong. And so that's an issue that is ongoing. I believe and I know that constitutional change on affirmative action can go a long way. We've seen that happen in Sierra Leone where there is affirmative action. We've seen that happen in a lot of some countries where there is affirmative action. In a country like Nigeria, I remember that back in my old life, I worked on that for many years. And the pushback was really for religion and cultural perspective. But is women in politics something that is important and ripe? Yes. Are we almost there? Very, very difficult. We are not there, but we're getting there. So the goal for many of us is really to start looking at supporting women from local elections, which is where right now everybody's like, that's where women belong, but that's not really the truth. But at least beginning there to build capacity, build women, and begin to get quota to apply for national level government bodies and elections. That's we're already doing. That many of us have done. But then looking at the federal level and all that, how do we get women increased gender participation is something that is an ongoing discussion. And I agree with you. Yes, it's very important. I see you've unmuted your mic, so I'm going to stop. I'm learning the rules and I'm trying.
Thank you very much, Ms. Egbuka, and you're doing brilliantly with just taking the cues. That question is really close to my heart as well, and I very much appreciate the way you have placed your answer within our cultural background and context. And we realize that many times when we're having conversations about gender inequity, gender inclusivity, many people refer back to culture. And I've heard people having conversations even about how a woman's partner would feel if she is running for position. So I'm wondering how we can begin to think of a reorientation and perhaps education streams to address this sort of disconnection and limited knowledge on the importance of having representativeness across all boards of electoral positions. So I would say thank you very much again. I would also come back to Professor Mugai, and I'll take the question from Professor Gathi first. He says, thank you for the good discussion. I understand Professor Mugai's concerns about resorting to courts to resolve electoral disputes. But given he and Ms. Egbuka's agreement, or given that he and Ms. Egbuka agree that political parties as well as legislatures are also very weak, it seems that there are not many choices besides citizens taking to the streets. Even if courts sometimes make mistakes, should we not embrace the fact that the finality of elections is sometimes determined in courts, given the fact that other choices, such as those that may lead to post-election violence, may not be ideal? If that is the case, perhaps then should we add the strengthening of independent courts to the list of rebuilding democracy? Professor Mugai, that question is yours.
Thank you very much. I assume that I should start off with the question of gender. I had the great fortune when I worked in the state law office to have had the opportunity to attempt to translate the promise of the Constitution of Kenya, which states that no one gender would occupy more than 2/3 of the public positions and so on. We went through 4 drafts of bills, 4 drafts. None of them saw the light of day. It is one of the major regrets of my career in public service. But I learned something from it. I learned that we need to carry the public with us. And I discovered that the public perceived the creation of special positions for women not as a democratic process, not as something enriching the democratic space, but as something rewarding the friends, the women friends and relatives of politicians. And we had no public buy-in. The public didn't feel invested. And I think we need to do a lot of work around that. The second thing, and this is controversial and a bit shocking to those who are true believers, I did not see the enthusiasm among women political actors, especially those who were already in elected positions. And I know that that is a controversial thing to say, but it is true. I did not see among those who were working with me in Parliament the enthusiasm, the zeal that you require when you are pushing an agenda of that nature. Many of our listeners who have worked around other bigger issues like race know this phenomena very well. That the small elite that arrives sometimes kicks the ladder so that there are no new arrivals. And I did feel a little bit of that and was a bit disappointed. So that my own advice is that in order to counter this fallback position of the political elite, their fallback position, which is self-serving and obviously dishonest, is we are not doing this because our culture and religion do not require this. That is not true. In the meantime, the president, the prime minister, the attorney general, the chief justice, all these people are educating their children, their girls in the best universities money can pay for. So we have a dishonest conversation in our society that we need to address honestly. It is not our culture. It is not our background. It is not our history. It is our failure to live up to the challenge of the times that we live in. I can tell you, however, that nature has an amazing way of settling some of these disputes. When I went to law school, the number of girls in my class were about 30%. Today, in an average law class, the number of girls is 51%. If you go to the postgraduate medical school, the number of girls are 60%. So the system is resetting in the professional side. And it is a question of time before, in my view, those kicking and screaming in the opposite direction are overwhelmed by the tide of history. But we must help history. We must help history. And I think we need to sensitize around the question that these things will not happen because of the goodwill of those in power of authority. They will only happen because we have a coalition of forces that make it possible for them not to ignore it as an issue. Right now, in many parts of our continent, they can ignore it quite happily, quite safely, and get away with it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. I think that you have just given us some practical insights into just some of the questions that would arise from the conversations around gender inclusivity and the role of the candidates themselves, and also how we begin to perhaps nominate candidates and how we engage in the process. So I see a whole education stream here. I see a whole dissemination, a whole public conversation stream on beginning the rebuilding conversation, and also seeing how we can draw from the experiences of professional fields that you have mentioned as well. So we hope that the translation will be made from education into politics and into elections. There's still a question there about just the role of courts that Professor Gathi asked. I don't know if you wanted to address that. So strengthening independent courts, should we think about that in rebuilding democracy?
Well, I think that courts are important, especially because of the final point you made earlier, which was that if an electoral process is to be determined with finality, and then a court should be able to do that, and probably the highest court available in that jurisdiction. Now, I'm not sure that I know for a fact that the judiciary in Kenya has been, over the last maybe 15 to going to 20 years, has been very capacitated, whether you can be very, has been capacitated to a very high level. And I can tell you this, and it may sound like a joke, I have been in petitions where the judges have a better command of the law and the technology. Lawyers, because they have an election petition every 5 years, they never quite enter into the ecosystem of the electronic system. Judges, because they've been training over and over and over again, they are very good at it. And I have been in petitions where the judges are asking questions and the lawyers look blank. So I would agree with my good friend, Professor Gadi, that there is something to be said about capacity, especially technical capacity, because the truth is that election law is reasonably straightforward. It's reasonably straightforward. But in fact, I think electoral codes are the most prescriptive laws I have ever seen, because they say, go to the voting booth, remove the vote, cast it, put your finger here, do this. It's very, very prescriptive. Give it to the returning officer, put it in It's a very prescriptive law. So we're not saying that judges need to be taught complex jurisprudence. No, they actually need to be capacitated to understand the technology and to command it. But above all else, you must remember this: the integrity of any judicial process globally. And I've had the great fortune to sit in tribunals in many places other than my home. The integrity of that process is as good as the person, the person and his integrity. And so I think that we must get the judiciary capacitated in that way, but we must continue to ensure that the judiciary recruits and retains only the most ethical of the profession. Because if we don't do that, even if all the electronics are good, everything else is good, something will go wrong. Now, that is a long shot because, as we all know, everywhere in the globe, judiciaries are struggling with that.
Thank you, Prof. Mugai. That is an just apt answer. I would go to Ms. Eboka now. We have talked about the role of technology. We have seen how technology has somewhat revolutionized the electoral process. We have seen how it has opened up the space and invited non-state actors, citizens to follow in the collation of votes. However, we have also seen that technology can be manipulated. We saw in Nigeria where there were conversations about whether or not the technology was working. We've also seen situations where, like Professor Mugai mentioned, the technology platforms also acknowledge that there could be internal manipulation. So how do we address these issues moving forward? Technology is actively contributing to transparency and openness. However, technology can also be misused and manipulated. Where is the balance and what do we do?
Thank you so much for that. But that's a question that many people have really battled with. Because the sincere truth is that we cannot, where we are in the world today and where elections sit across the globe, we cannot dispute the importance of technology in our electoral processes, because we have seen the failure of the processes that we adopted before, the manual transmission, counting, and of votes, and we have seen the difference that technology can make. But in terms of manipulation, is this something that is unique to Africa and is our own really different? I worry, because the question becomes, we are seeing the same arguments even in the United States. We are seeing the same arguments in many countries in the world. But I think that the middle point, if you ask me, will be accountability, transparency in the process, and genuine political will of not just the government, political will on the side of government, and two, zeal and willingness of citizens to really work on it. I'll take a practical example in Nigeria. We saw where the youths mobilized themselves without any fund on their own on the internet. On social media, they gathered, they campaigned. I joined a lot of Twitter chats where I saw people planning, polling units, agents, just by themselves for a candidate they were interested in. So that means that if we could really give assurance to these youths that the process can be transparent, accountable, and have integrity, then there is hope. But on the other side, you then see a government that is not even willing at this point to use technologies that have acquired themselves. And that becomes the biggest fear. is how do we then get government? How do we then get government to really understand, value, and be willing to support these systems to ensure transparency and integrity? Do I have the answer? I don't really think so, but I just think there's lots of genuine discussions, genuine push that we are going to have, transparency in the process. The courts is an avenue that is being used to challenge a lot of the things, and we are waiting to see what comes out of it. And I really worry also about the idea of judiciary deciding every elections in Africa. That's something by the side, but I know that that's a discussion for another day, but I think that technology is a way to go, and we should use it effectively.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ebuka. Now we have a few more questions. I think we can take about 3 more questions, and then we'll have our closing remarks. So next, I'll come to you, Prof. I note, and this is a question from Professor Akinkugbe, I note your caution not to delegitimize the courts by subjecting them to adjudicating on every election dispute. I also note your caution for context of each region. The Nigerian election season is on, and we are already experiencing significant judicialization of elections. I wonder if you see a middle ground until we get the election process right. What might the middle ground look like? So we're having lots of conversations now about the role of courts. And the next question is also related. So I'll take both questions to give you time to answer them, if that's okay. And then we'll come to our final questions. Professor Mugai is right that some matters are of purely domestic character and should not be internationalized. But what if the domestic question also simultaneously raises international legal questions? For example, South Africa argued apartheid was a purely domestic issue and opposed UN oversight, as well as an ICJ advisory opinion about its presence in Southwest Africa. Today, the ICJ in cases like Iran versus the US recognizes that even when disputes have a political dimension, the courts will nevertheless assume jurisdiction as long as there is an international legal question. Are African international courts too fragile to adopt such reasoning? So both questions, Professor Mugai.
Well, let me start by saying that I do not wish to be understood to suggest that a state can be the sole arbiter of whether a matter that implicates it is of a purely domestic character or it raises international legal issues. I would not subscribe to that view. But I want us to be very clear about the political nature of elections, because elections go to the core of how the state legitimizes its governance. And if that process is outsourced to an external or tribunal or court, there is a real grave chance that there will be a discordant, there may be a discordant situation in which those affected by what the International Tribunal thinks is a perfectly sound jurisprudential position may find it politically untenable and implementable. The consequence of which is that the rule of law is diminished. I have always said, I know this is not a very popular position, and I have come to it after many years of reflection. I started my career as a maximalist. I thought that the court should take every conceivable dispute and stamp its authority on fairness and justice and legality. Now, in this, the evening of my life, I have become a minimalist. In the development of institutions like the judiciary, less is more. Less is more. If we allow what I call the judicialization of politics, if we allow the judicialization of politics, we diminish the dignity, the authority, and the standing of the judicature within our constitutional apparatus. In my view, therefore, only the clearest and deserving major issues should end up before. And let me tell you what we've tried to do in Kenya, and I'm not by any way suggesting that Kenya is a model of anything. I'm just suggesting we've tripped and fallen so many times here that we have learned something from our mistakes. For example, what we've done is we've taken all pre-election day disputes away from the courts. And we've set up a parallel quasi-judicial administrative process that determining party nominations, party lists, all those things that would keep the judiciary totally preoccupied with things that it has no resources to deal with. I think that is one of the most successful things that we have done with our electoral process. The other thing we've done is limit access to the Supreme Court. Only the presidential petition ends up in the Supreme Court, ideally. Now, that has also meant that you do not have a very long, protracted post-voting electoral dispute regime. I think that it would help. I have read that in the French system that you do the election, and with or without a petition, the Supreme Court pronounces itself on the legitimacy of the outcome, mostly rubber stamping the outcome. I don't think that that's a very, very useful way to go about it. I have read about the Nigerian, especially presidential disputes, the Ghanaian one, for example, as well. And I think that there is still something to be said for a final authoritative judicial pronouncement on the outcome that helps the nation, those who have won and those who have lost, to say, okay, that is now the end until the next 5 years. Let's now go home and work in our gardens, go to take our children to school, and do the other things that we do. But that, subject to that caution, I think the court has a role. That role should not be unduly expanded. It should be a limited role. It should be a role that allows the court not to be sucked into every conceivable municipal, county, regional conflict. It should be a limited role that allows the court to pronounce itself on the big issues of that specific election. In Nigeria, for example, I would imagine that the election of the president is important. The election of the governor is important.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugai. And we are coming to the end of this interesting webinar. I have one final question from Ms. Ebuka. I would ask you to please keep the answer short and also maybe make your closing remarks so that we can end just right on time. And then I'll come to Prof. Mugai for your final remarks. So the question is, what can African countries do about foreign involvement in national elections, such as we have seen with the unethical election campaigning on social media by foreign consulting firms, such as Cambridge Analytica?
No, thank you so much. I'm going to keep this to just one sentence. The truth is that foreign involvement is something that we've heard everywhere, even and in almost all the countries in the world during election. Is there a role for the government? Yes, and I'll end on that by saying that our African governments and institutions have to learn to build itself to be strong, to have the will and the zeal to carry out election without interference. We've got what it takes. It's just us wanting, it's just us. We've seen a lot of arguments around the tech industry, foreign interference, Russia, China, US, to mention all the names that you hear around there. But the truth is that if we make up our mind, if we decide and we push the political way to do things right, we'll get it right. I think that'll be my ending statement, by saying that we can get it right if we really decide that we want to.
Okay,
thank you.
Perfect. So we can get it right. Professor Mugai, final statement. 30 seconds,
I'm worried
please.
I'm worried about two things going forward. As a citizen, and now maybe a senior citizen in the scheme of things, I'm worried about the youth. If the youth feel left out, if they feel that their vote doesn't matter, our democracy is at great peril. We must find a way of rejuvenating the youth base. And not only by the youth coming out to vote, but by the youth standing for political office, and not just standing and ending up in parliament, but ending up in parliament and making change. Because in Kenya, we have a very youthful parliament, one of the most youthful. And half the time we don't have a quorum. So I worry about that issue about youth. We must worry about it very much. I worry about one last thing in 1 second. I worry about the future of civil society. In Kenya, we got where we did by the vibrancy of civil society from the mid-1980s way into the time we made the new constitution in 2010. Civil society was loud and angry and vibrant and impactful. Some of us were absorbed into government. Some of our critics would say we were co-opted into government. Maybe they are right. Now, today, civil society is more diminished. That is a very real danger to the future of our democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mugai. This has been an excellent, fascinating event. The event is co-sponsored by the African Society of International Law, the African Association of International Law, Afronomicslaw.org, and the African International Economic Law Network. I thank our panelists, I thank the American Society of International Law, and I thank all our participants. Thank you.